I think an article you wrote a very long time ago at this point, the 12 guiding principles of command line interface design. I've referenced back to that a lot. One thing I want to know though is you'd write a lot of CLIs still, but you don't use Node. Do you not use Oclif anymore for those CLIs?
I haven't used Oclif in a while. And really just because I haven't written a CLI on that scale in a long time.
Hmm.
I still think it has good utility there because like most of my CLIs are in Rust now, but like that would not be a good choice for a lot of what people are using Oclif for because it's like I was saying, you might have a server team that's doing like Postgres and stuff. And if they don't have a lot of Rust, if they don't have a lot of CLI experience, you need something that's pretty simple. And even though people complain about JavaScript a lot, I think any software engineer can write it, right? And if it's something they only need to do for 5-10% of their job, I think it's a good common denominator for a lot of developers.
So other than like startup time and potentially like this like composability and simplicity to contribute to for large teams, what do you think are the really important like DX aspects to keep in mind when you're like building a CLI? What are your like fundamentals? Every time you start one, you're like, okay, these are the things that I want to keep in mind.
There's some basics, things you might expect, like using standard error and standard out correctly. One thing I'll say on that, because I think this is commonly misunderstood, standard error is not for errors. It's for any information that isn't part of the normal output, right? Oftentimes that's warning and errors, but it might just be progress information. Anytime that you just need to have something go to the user, that's what it's there for. And I think that's one important one that's often misunderstood. And I think putting some thought into what you name things. One philosophy I have is that command names should always be verbs and not nouns. And that I think tends to bring a consistent interface to the way things are built. Like for example, I'm sure we'll talk about ASDF, but there's a command to change the global version of different tools. And the way you do that is ASDF global and then the name. Global's it's not a verb. It should be actually ASDF is changing this to set. So I think they realize that it is a mistake. So now it's ASDF set global, like dash dash global, something like that. That makes a lot more sense. I think the sort of name of the CLI, a verb, and then the things it does.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are some like CLIs that I've used that I feel like the noun is okay. So like GitHub, for example, so it's like hub PR, we're like doing something on a PR, GitHub PR checkout or whatever. That feels like okay, but there's like a lot of top level categories.
Yeah, it's basically the last thing. So it's GitHub PR create. So that's good. And like with any rule, there are exceptions, like Heroku logs. That just works. I don't think it should be Heroku logs list, Heroku logs view. Sometimes conciseness is just better. But yeah, I think as a general rule to start from, it should be a tier could be fine. And actually when it's a tier, the middle stuff probably should be a noun because you're describing some middle thing, whether that's pull requests or repositories. In the case of GitHub CLI, I think it's a good way to do it.
Cool. So let's start jumping into all the other projects that you've been working on. There's a lot for me to review when preparing for this episode. So the first one I'd like to talk about is Usage. Could you tell us a little more about that project and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so Usage is, in a sentence, it's Swagger for CLIs, right? It's mostly just a spec it's written in a language that people probably had heard of called Cuddle. It's just a configuration format. Maybe it could have been JSON or YAML, but I went with Cuddle because reasons, and it was fun. But it just describes what a CLI looks like, what arguments it accepts, what flags it has. And I think probably most importantly is all the help. And so the idea is that once you've defined a CLI with this specification, then things like generating markdown documentation for help or having completion support can be much easier. And so the target market really for people using Usage isn't end users. It's really for CLI framework authors and vendors. Because if anybody out there has written completions in particular before, they'll know it's really hard. It is not a lot of fun. And if you've got users that want it to work in Bash, in ZSH, in PowerShell, in new shell, like you've got to repeat that really painful logic several times over. And how language server protocols work in IDEs is similar ideas. You just need to make this relatively easy to dump spec. And then the Usage, which runs as a runtime on the user's machine, can basically generate the completion code for you. And it basically enables very powerful completion support without needing to code for each individual shell.
That's pretty awesome. I think this shows like your expertise in building CLIs, because this is an area that you won't get in for a while, but like when you start trying to like do this, it's, it won't be too bad. I'll just do, this for like Z shell. And so, wait, what about fish? What about whatever? The missions are really gnarly. They're like surprisingly gross.
They're horrible. Absolutely horrible. And part of it is just that I never want to write one again. So my hope is with usage, I've written it once and now I don't have to repeat that for every CLI I write.
Yeah, it's cool how it also does other outputs also, having man pages and markdown documentation, just so much simpler. And I like how most of the time when I've written CLIs, it's been in Node, and the documentation and all of that is a part of the definition, and they're so linked, whereas this is so primitive that I can use it on just like scripts or just like whatever I want to describe more, which I find very interesting.
Yeah. And we'll get into like how there's a lot of integration with Mies here, but being able to have just a single bash file that can have this completion support, have doc generation around us was a big goal for me with writing that. And documentation is huge. I think getting back to your earlier question about what makes a CLI good, I think you got to have Markdown, you got to have a good website that people can, Command F and search and shows up well in SEO and all that stuff, I think is paramount. And I just released a newer CLI called Pitchfork, and I was able to just, once I dropped my little dumper thing in that created the usage spec, I just had all that. It was amazing. It was when I built that for Mies, it took me weeks to write all that.
It feels like the recipes for a new Oclif shaped thing are like there. There's like something about this new like meta framework for CLIs, but it's not necessarily about the direct implementation. So as much as it is like the infrastructure around it, it's pretty cool.